The author begins this chapter by imagining asking the question today within the Western nations, asking people, do you believe in God? And he states that some would say yes, no, I don't know. He actually says that likely no one would ask what you mean by God or which deity you have in mind. I need to disagree with this statement because my experience debating atheists and skeptics online has informed me that people are informed about this issue far more than most people think. Your average atheist skeptic today has been influenced to the point where they are privy to first century deities of the ancient Near East. And so that's not my experience. I do understand the author's point, but that is a common reply to me in debates, is that which God are you talking about? And I find that today atheists and skeptics, while they don't understand classical theism and have a complete misconception about what classical theism is all about. As a matter of fact, a guy by the name of Matt Dillahunty, whom I'll be debating in early June, he constantly asks the question, which god? Zeus, Mithras, Isis, Osiris, and even Bill Maher today brings this stuff up. It's very popular with the writings of Bart Ehrman, a lot of popular skeptics. This information is in the public these days. So I found it interesting that the author started this chapter this way, because that's not the state of affairs now within post-Christian America. Denny's Turney's, the chair of theology at Cambridge University, actually gave an inaugural lecture concerning how to be a good atheist. And he pointed out that most atheists today, because they reference these created gods, the gods of the pantheon, and they try to link the biblical God with these other gods, which are created gods, they totally and completely miss the entire point that the God of the Bible is not a being like unto other beings, which was what the Lord told Israel, is that you thought I was like you. God is not a maximally great being. God is the greatest conceivable, quote, being, unquote, and I usually use capital B, capital E, ing, that God is, as Aquinas said, he is being itself subsisting, ipsum esse subsistens, that the God of the Bible is not like any other super being like we see superheroes today with the Marvel Universe, and the idea that there's just these maximal attributes that somehow cohere some way, and they'll point out how omnipotence and omniscience, that these things are incoherent and they clash. But within biblical theism, there's the notion of the divine simplicity, that God's essence is his existence. God doesn't have accidental attributes. Everything for God is essential, and therefore our understanding and even predicating concerning divine attributes, we predicate them in an analogical sense, that there is no univocal one-to-one correlation. And even David Brintley Hart brings this out in his book, where he points out that the God that a lot of Christians believe in, and especially the God that atheists tend to think exists, or the denial that this kind of God exists, they lump him in with all of these other deities, which is an absolute category mistake. God is not a being. God is the very, not to use it in an existential sense, God is not the, as the neo-evangelicals use the ground of being, existentialism, but in a Thomistic sense, that God is being itself, and that all that is, we participate in the one who is pure being, pure life. That idea that has been delivered to us in classical theism from the Greeks, in the sense of Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, the unmoved mover, the one of Plato and Plotinus, etc. I do understand the author's point, where he brings out the fact that Christianity and the idea of worshiping one God was a peculiarity within the first century because of the pluralism involved in the first century. But America, as a post-Christian culture, we are a lot like the first century, which is why I found this chapter so important and why it interested me so much, because of my ministry experiences over 30 years now in engaging skeptics and atheists and evangelizing and street witnessing, etc., dialoguing with literally thousands of people. I have seen the culture change, and the pluralism of the first century is alive and well in the 21st century. As the author moves on, he points out this assumption. He points out that the early Christian belief and practice that made Christianity so different. And he brings out that this insistence that there's only one God, and then the demand for a monolatry, a worship of only one God, maybe a henotheism in a sense. The next section in this chapter is a world full of gods, and here's where the author brings out the plurality of divine beings. and how the first century people, that they had reverence for all kinds of deities, all kinds of spirits, and they reverenced them, they honored them, and it was a daily part of their practice, it was a daily part of their lives. And the author brings up the various kinds and spheres where these gods existed in the minds of the first century people. Even within the Roman pantheon, they had this notion of the high god, the supreme god, so to speak, either Jupiter for the Roman or Zeus for the Greek. And the author points out that there was really a virtual cafeteria of Roman era deities from all of the nations that comprised the Roman Empire. And he points out this pluralism by illustrating what archaeologists found in Val d'Anon in the foothills of northern Italy. They found inscriptions to really all of these gods: Jupiter, Minerva, Saturn, Mercury, Mars, Venus, Diana, Luna, Hercules, Mithras, Isis. I'm not even going to try to pronounce the last one here. And he mentions that it's a small town, that these some 24 gods are mentioned in inscriptions. And then he points out as well as Philippi in Macedonia, where it reflects this Greco-Roman mixture of deities: Zeus, Hera, Minerva, which is Athena's the other name known by Minerva. All of these deities in these small towns, small provinces. He brings up these well-known deities that we just mentioned, and he speaks about the fact that the Roman Empire, they just, like Hinduism today, they just opened up their arms and brought all of these deities within their religious consciousness, or as John Walton speaks of, the cognitive environment within that culture. The author brings up Mithras and Isis, which today, with the popularity of the atheist skeptics that write on a popular level, this information has been disseminated to our culture, and I hear it brought up a lot in dialogue where Christianity so-called borrowed from Osiris or Mithras, the Egyptian gods. And so he brings up Mithras and Isis, and how the military actually disseminated the worship of these gods, even as far as Britain. He mentions the various high deities, and then even these lesser deities, these lories, these guardian spirits, where families would honor these lories that happened to be deceased loved ones that were elevated for goodness or something like that. And so they were expected to reverence these. The first century people were expected to reverence these lesser gods daily in the lorarium, that was a small altar within every Roman household. Reminds me of Sikhism today, the idea that there's a room devoted to making various offerings as they did to these small laries, these lesser gods. Today, even the Hmong Chinese will honor their ancestors in a very similar manner. And the author speaks about even protective laries, protective of locales, protective crossroads, and even the being guardians of the Roman state itself. The author talks about this ubiquitous reverence all throughout the Roman Empire. Even mentions that the modern day notion of religion is an aspect, a carryover from the influence of Christianity upon the Western culture, this idea of identifying with a particular religion and worshiping on a particular day. The first century people, they would honor these deities daily. It was everywhere in the first century Roman life. The author speaks of the fact that the denial to honor these deities or to reference these deities was a problem for the early church. It was offensive to the first century worldview. They honored the gods, it was a part of their life, and they expected it. And so we see the Apostle Paul dealing with this issue in various letters where he speaks about idols and sacrificing to idols and to not ask questions, but yet if it's brought up, to not partake, etc. These various gods also had, as the author speaks of, these portfolios. If you were going on a sea voyage, you would say, honor Poseidon, give an offering for safety, or if you had some healing, Asclepius would be one that you would go in and thank and offer something for the health and well-being, or maybe you'd go to Aphrodite, and if you were seeking love, and offer something to that god in order to fall in love, or something of that nature. But the author speaks of these patron gods of even your guilds. For me, I'm not sure what the patron god or even the patron saint would be for music as a musician myself, but if I were to want to have great success, I would, being in the first century, offer something to the patron god of my particular guild. The author also brings up the idea of the gods and how Christianity and within Judaism, that this word idol is not in pagan classical writings. And it was something of a one-off or an anomaly, that Christians wouldn't honor these deities, that Christians wouldn't reverence these deities, but they saw these deities as images or phantasms, or even worse, as demons, evil spirits. And so for Christians, that is what differentiated them from the rest of the culture. And Christians had to refuse to partake of the reverencing of these gods in daily life. And as the author brings up, I'm sure that was a tremendous challenge to navigate that tightrope of not offending family members, but standing up for convictions. There is so much application for the church today out of the knowledge of the circumstances within the first century. I really enjoyed this chapter. It was my favorite chapter out of the book. The author, again, points out that the refusal to reverence these household deities or these patron saints of cities, or even the patron saint of the Roman Empire itself, was highly offensive. And it was a scandal for the first century mind. And so the fact that Christians called these deities idols or demons was offensive. And the apostle, writing to the Thessalonians, speaks of the fact that they had turned from these idols to serve the living God. And so there was a distinct vocabulary that Christianity had within its corpus, where the idea of the idol and the idol being nothing, very insulting to the first century mind. Reminds me of our own woke culture today, where if you're not in line with the mantra of the day, you're ridiculed and you're offensive to the culture. And he brings up the various terms that were used by the apostle. And then the author brings up the particular offense. He mentions the fact that it was understood that Jews, that their national peculiarities were tolerated. They may have been bizarre, objectionable, but they tolerated it. But Christians coming from a pagan culture and to refuse to worship these deities was scandalous. We even find within the writings of the Roman historians how they would ridicule Christians. They would call them the atheists for denying the pantheon, even the high gods, the lesser gods, and these lories, how they rejected every aspect of the religious identity of the first century individual in order to worship the one true and living God, which is a creator God. And so our modern culture today, we have inherited that worldview, that mindset. The author cites some of Paul's writings and mentions the fact that there is only but one God for the Christian. And then he mentions the Christian God, how the Christian God, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, the Christian God is not an even playing field. God is not a God among other gods, or as it's said within scholasticism, God is not being qua being. He's not among the community of beings or creatures, but that he's outside, transcendent, but also immanent. And Paul, writing to Timothy, brings out an extremely important part of the doctrine of God and the identity of the God of the Bible, where he says he is the blessed and only sovereign. Again, because God's had these geographical areas, these guilds that they were in charge of, these aspects of life, the notion of only one God, and this God being the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords and the God of Gods, very, very insulting to the first century people and their religious sensibilities. But the apostle writes, "It is he alone who is immortal and dwells in unapproachable light, whom no one has ever seen or can see. To him be honor and eternal dominion." And to that I have to just say, amen. Then he speaks about the relationship of Jesus Christ to this one God. And of course, ultimately, taking the statements of the Old Testament, the early church formulated their understanding of Jesus Christ as Messiah, as the Son of God, as the Lord. And even Paul uses language that for any reasonable individual, there's no doubt that the New Testament teaches that Jesus Christ is God of very God. And the denial of that is preposterous as far as what the New Testament actually teaches concerning the identity of Jesus Christ. And I remember one rabbi saying that the problem that he had with the New Testament was that on every page, Jesus Christ is presented as God.